Hi, everyone. I want to devote much of this lecture and the following one to talking about resistance to apartheid. But we need to sort of conclude our discussion about the architecture of apartheid here by looking at some of the impacts that these laws put into place by the National Party government had on society, right? The goal of apartheid, as the name itself indicates, the apartheid Afrikaans word means apartness or separateness, and that was accomplished to a great extent. The whites were insulated from the black experience. Thus, they did not empathize very well with the black plight. It was completely removed from them. And they didn't see the inequities and radical disparities built into this whole system. Many whites, would live their entire lives with little exposure to black people, except perhaps domestic servants or the menial laborers with whom they would interact in their work only on a fairly limited basis, right? So the system of isolation, which was really one of the chief goals of apartheid, did work for whites. But of course, for blacks, this meant that they were cut off from opportunities and advancement, and that among themselves they simply, were blocked from most opportunities. And so the racial relationship under apartheid was, radically disparate, right? The white experience was at a complete remove from the black experience or from the non-white experience. The whites lived very much by the standards of Western culture, Western civilization. It was not a far cry from what one might have found in Europe or the United States in the same periods. But the society among the non-whites, might as well have been on a different planet for all that apartheid did for them, right? Which was very little. We can see this disparity, for instance, in the infrastructure, and we've talked a lot about this, so I don't want to belabor the point too much. But in areas where blacks were limited, there was little by way of things like fresh water systems, waste disposal. These tended to be filled with garbage, and there were diseases attendant upon exposure to unclean water and raw sewage and things like this, cholera and typhoid fever and other things were pretty common in these black areas, as was tuberculosis and other things. I'll talk about that in a minute here. But to demonstrate this infrastructure disparity, let's look at the two diagrams here at the bottom of the slide. Okay, so the South African government built housing in the black townships essentially along one of two basic house plans. Both of them 4-room dwellings. Okay, so but one, they might build it with indoor plumbing with a bathroom or not, right? So this is one without a bathroom. So this would be bedroom 1, bedroom 2. This is the living area, and this is some kind of kitchen. And then this is a similar kind of thing. Here's the kitchen, here's the living room, here's the 2 bedrooms. This one does have an indoor bathroom. For this one, the bathroom would be a latrine out in the back of the house that may or may not be connected to any sort of sewer system. Probably not. Okay. So these are this is the basic dwelling. And a large extended family might live in such a space. And this is only for those who were lucky enough to get one of these government-built houses. Many residents of townships were forced to gather whatever building materials they could and to assemble some kind of shack out of corrugated iron and wood. and I mean, these were leaky and drafty and really unhealthy situations to live in. They had to construct their own latrines, and so the exposure to the diseases attendant upon that were constant. Whites, on the other hand, lived in comfortable dwellings. Okay, so this is a typical kind of middle class white house. A sizable living room with a dining room, a sizable kitchen, 3 bedrooms here. With a bathroom and a separate toilet, and so someone could be taking a bath or a shower while another person would be using the toilet. And then a garage out back. And notice that they built in, and this is not just fairly common, this is ubiquitous, it's everywhere. They built in a servant's quarter together with a separate WC, a separate toilet / bath facility. But this is at a remove, right? And even middle class white families tended to have domestic servants. A wealthier family would have them, probably several servants' quarters, and may have a household staff of as many as 5 to 10 or more people. I became acquainted when I lived in South Africa, only for a limited time, with a rather famous, I should say the family of a rather famous individual. This was Gary Player, who was one of the greatest golfers of all time, one of the few people to win all 4 majors in the PGA. I actually got to know his wife. I never met Gary himself, but his wife Vivian invited me and some other people working for the organization I was working for over for lunch one day. And they lived in a substantial dwelling, right? So there was a gate out in front of their compound that said by appointment only. And they had a guardhouse and a porter there. I should say an armed guardhouse. And they seemed to have a domestic staff of, about, I don't know, 5 to 10 people. In a spacious dwelling, and Mrs. Player was a tremendously generous person. But so for the very wealthy and the elite, they lived in substantially more than this and had many more servants, right? But even middle class dwellings were built with servants' quarters, where a black or non-white domestic servant would have a small room. But of course, it's cut off, right? So this is the apartheid infrastructure again. In the township, whole books could and have been written on township society, and it's a topic that I, actually like a lot, having worked in townships and enjoyed the culture there and everything. The apartheid government tried, actually fairly desperately and in various ways, to create ethnic divisions in townships. In Soweto, for instance, they tried to create neighborhoods that were entirely Sotho or Zulu or Xhosa or Tswana. They failed at this and eventually just kind of gave up. But, in their justification for white rule, again, as we talked about, they created these 11 different divisions of Africans, which meant that whites composed the largest ethnic group in all of South Africa, right? So they tried to perpetuate that by dividing people up in the townships. And ultimately, people lived they flouted these laws. People from different ethnic groups ended up getting married to each other, building houses next to each other, or occupying houses next to each other. And, by the 1960s, that policy of ethnic division was mostly defunct. Township society was a vibrant cultural space, right? And this is where we could sort of get lost in a discussion about this. Music, poetry, even institutions like the shebeen, which is the equivalent of the kind of Jim Crow era speakeasy, a place where people went to drink and socialize, and maybe even have sex. I mean, this is a vibrant place where people would gather. There were documents in the Williams book about shebeens. There's one document. I won't take time necessarily to look at this, but there was a magazine called Drum, or I should say, a newspaper called Drum, which was published all over South Africa in the township communities. And this document, starting on page 267 in the Williams book, is about well, it's a publication of Drum magazine. Okay, and then in document number 6, starting on page 272, this is a report from a journalist who was eventually banned from South Africa, ended up in the United States, and committed suicide in 1965 because he was never able to return to South Africa and just became depressed. But he talks about being in a shebeen there and being with white reporters from the United States, and they've just never seen anything like this, right? And so, I mean, this there's a real vibrancy to the townships. Apartheid society, or apartheid laws, could not quash that, so to speak. Right? However, the impact of violence and oppression over time was tremendous. And I mean, this could be seen in the faces of people in South Africa who had endured apartheid for so long, right? So, there's only so much you can do to stay upbeat when the police are constantly patrolling the streets and harassing you, when they're cut off from every economic opportunity, right? This has an effect, of course, on things like child development. Many studies have been done about kids growing up in violent situations, how this creates, high levels of certain toxic chemicals in the brain, the equivalent of essentially PTSD they suffer with for their entire lives. And so, I mean, there are all sorts of impacts that we could try to quantify and track in people who lived under such an oppressive system. But it's obviously going to have an effect on the way this happens. It manifested itself, especially in family life in South Africa. Not only the most obvious, which is that women tended to stay in the homelands while the men went to try to find employment in the urban space. I saw this with some families I got to know really well. One family I particularly loved, their last name was Gent, Gent. And Mama Gent was kind of like my South African mom. I absolutely love that woman. She was just incredibly generous and vibrant, and just a wonderful person to be around. But I knew the Gent family, and they had several children and grandchildren who lived kind of in this little shack in Mangaung outside of Bloemfontein. But I knew the Gent family for 2 months and never saw a father. And then one day I went to the Gent house, and there was a guy sort of sitting out front, and I turned to my associate who had been there longer than I had and knew the Gents longer than I did. I was like, "Who's that?" And he said, "Oh, that's Ntate Gent." Ntate means father in Sotho. That's the father. And he worked in the mines. I think in Velkom, but maybe in Johannesburg. I can't remember exactly. And he was a wonderful person too, but I had no idea that he actually existed for 2 months of knowing this family, right? He was so removed from them and only able to come home for a few days every few months, given the, kind of the economic situation the family was in. They lived in essentially a 3-room shack, right, made of corrugated iron. But in addition to that, the stresses of living under an oppressive system created a lot of tension within families, even those who lived together in the townships, right, or in the homelands. There was a high degree of domestic violence that came from the stress, and these are all, backed up, or the trends have been studied by psychologists and sociologists, and this is really quite predictable. Given the conditions that people lived in. The divisions of apartheid society manifested themselves in a number of ways. Let's we'll talk briefly about two of these. One of these is in poverty and wealth, and this should be a pretty obvious point, right? White people lived, as I said earlier, very much according to the standards of other parts of the Western world. White South Africa was like living in Western Europe or in the United States. Right? Substantial dwellings, um, disposable income, paid leave, benefits, healthcare, insurance, things like this, provided for people. Blacks, on the other hand, lived by a standard that was as poor as anywhere else in the world. There were very few efforts to track levels of poverty because the government was not much interested in devoting any resources to such things. It didn't care much about the plight of the blacks, right, or the non-whites, I should say. But the few studies that were done demonstrated that as many as 2/3 of black South Africans were living below the and there are kind of international measures for this, what is called the minimum living level, which depends on the area you live in, right? So, and the cost of living and all of that. But 2/3 of South Africans lived below that level, right? This internationally recognized level, and there was little being done to try to remedy this. Okay. And some South Africans were tremendously wealthy, right? Some of the wealthiest people in the world lived in South Africa. They were all white. I think that goes without saying. The despair in healthcare is another place where we can view the effects of apartheid. South Africa had some of the most advanced and innovative hospitals in the world. The world's first heart transplant took place in South Africa in the 1960s. In Cape Town. I believe the world's first artificial heart was developed in South Africa. I could be wrong about that. There were doctors there in medical schools doing cutting edge research, obviously. But the vast majority of resources were devoted to the needs of the white South African community. Medical education centered on their problems. And the vast majority of those who graduated from medical schools were white. Thompson produced a statistic, I believe, from 1980, where there were about 800 or something graduates of medical schools in that year, and 650 something of them were white. And the rest were divided among blacks and Indians and colored people. Okay, so, and the non-white doctors were too few to really service the needs of the non-white community, given that it was a much larger community than the white community. Diseases that were common among the whites and blacks were highly disparate. White people suffered from the chronic diseases of the Western world, things like diabetes and heart disease. Actually, coronary disease was higher in South Africa than in any other country in the world, I think largely because the diet of white South Africans was very high in the sorts of things that produce coronary disease. They eat a lot of meat, a lot of saturated fat and things like that in the diet. Black people, on the other hand, suffered from things like tuberculosis and cholera and typhoid fever and pneumonia. Diseases like this. Many children in South Africa had the diseases attendant upon malnutrition. If you look at the picture here from South Africa, I believe in the 1970s, of the two children suffering from kwashiorkor, this disease that causes distended bellies. This is a disease of malnutrition. It's a protein deficiency disease. You can see in the child on the left that his hair, I think that's anyway, it might be a girl, sorry. But the hair of this child does not have enough melanin in it. That's because the child does not have enough protein. And so the hair actually looks kind of white or blonde. This is common among children with kwashiorkor. And this in a country that, had, again, some of the most advanced medical schools and hospitals in the world, right? But none of that was put to the needs of the black community. And so naturally there was resistance, okay? I'm going to break this down into a couple of different kind of categories. I want to talk first about the resistance among the whites, because not all white people accepted apartheid. There were protesters. There were people who tried to challenge this. Okay. Some of that challenge, some of the criticism of apartheid came from the religious quarter. Almost immediately upon apartheid being put into place in the late 1940s, churches came out with statements condemning apartheid. This was especially true for the Church of England. And the Church of England would continue to be a quarter of protest. Forever tried to put into place laws that would prohibit black people or non-whites from entering churches that were segregated for whites. The Church of England and other religious institutions resisted this, and ultimately Verwoerd and the government backed down. So, the Anglican bishops came out against this. Other Protestant denominations, the Catholics and others, condemned apartheid. The one church that was the exception to this, at least initially, was the Dutch Reformed Church, which was the most common church among the Afrikaners. But even there, some clergymen broke ranks with their cohort and began to condemn apartheid. By the early 1960s, there were institutes started by Dutch Reformed clergy to try to bring blacks and whites together in communication. In general, the Dutch Reformed Church by the 1970s had turned against apartheid. This didn't mean that it had an effect necessarily, but there was religious condemnation almost universally by the mid to late 1970s. Universities were hotbeds for protest and resistance. White students formed organizations specifically to challenge apartheid. Anti-apartheid groups were common on university campuses, especially the University of Cape Town and the University of the Witwatersrand, which were the most progressive of all of the higher education institutions. White students formed an organization that ran throughout the country called the National Union of South African Students. When we talk about Steve Biko, we'll mention this, that he formed an organization called the South African Students Organization that broke away from this. But these liberal white students, protested, organized, put out publications condemning apartheid, calling for reform. In some cases, they were banned, arrested, banned from receiving funding from outside of South Africa. NUSAS, the white students, the students organization, was prohibited from progressing in a number of ways by the government. Another place where really kind of an interesting one where resistance came among the white community was in women's organizations. The documentary that I had you watch about apartheid, for instance, they interviewed members of this group called the Black Sash, right? And these were mostly middle-class white women who would wear this black sash and stand silently in public places, staging silent protests against apartheid, but they were highly visible in doing this. And the Black Sash was a kind of internationally renowned organization for its speaking out against apartheid. And the government tried to limit or ban its activities. The headquarters of the Black Sash were blown up by the by the apartheid government in the 1980s. I mean, there were all sorts of efforts made to try to put a stop to this. If you recall in the documentary, the women say that they're criticized for not being home with their children, right? That was their place. And the one woman says, well, I think that, we're doing our children a disservice if we stand back and accept apartheid. That actually we're serving our children better by being here than if we were at home with them. Many writers among the white community spoke out against apartheid. Alan Paton, whose book Cry the Beloved Country was published in 1947, and portrays race relations in a much in a very sympathetic light, calling for amiable relations between the two communities. Paton ended up publishing a series of essays in the 50s and 60s, speaking out against apartheid. Some of his stories continued to do this. Paton was actually interviewed in that same documentary. There's a section with him in there. And even though he, in that documentary at least, says, well, I think we have to understand where the Afrikaners are coming from, and I need to. And sometimes I find myself defending Prime Minister Milan. This is obviously an untenable system that we've put into place. There are several others we could mention. I'll just mention two more. Nadine Gordimer, who's pictured here with the black hat on, an internationally renowned author, won the Nobel Prize for Literature, I should say, in the 1980s. I can't remember the exact year. It might have been I think it was 1980s, early 1990s. Anyway, she was an outspoken critic of apartheid, and many of her stories deal with or kind of contain these implicit tones of criticism of apartheid. Same for the fellow Nobel Literature Prize winner J.M. Coetzee, an Afrikaner who wrote both in English and Afrikaans, but his stories and his essays and things also condemned apartheid and spoke out against it. Some politicians, some white politicians, were outspoken critics of apartheid. The most prominent of these was Helen Suzman, who is pictured here at the bottom, surrounded by black students. She was, from 1961 to 1974, the only member of parliament from the Progressive Party, which was the most outspoken anti-apartheid party in South Africa during the time. That was actually legal, I should say. The ANC and the PAC and others were illegal organizations. This one was legal. Suzman opposed every bill in Parliament that perpetuated apartheid through her entire career. She's a woman of great courage, one I admire tremendously. And up until 1960, there were elected representatives. They were all white, but representatives of the non-white communities. Those were finally banned and done away with in 1960. But some of those politicians were quite progressive as well. Ultimately, the criticism was often blunted. White resistance was often blunted by economic concerns. And this is one of the foremost themes we see among the white community, that they, even if they didn't like apartheid in theory, they benefited from it economically. Thompson points out the example of Harry Oppenheimer, who was one of the most wealthy individuals in the entire world. He became the chairman, upon the retirement of his father, of a conglomerate of companies that included the Anglo-American Corporation and the De Beers Consolidated Mines. He ran both of those companies for something like 25 to 30 years, and was listed again among the wealthiest individuals in the world. Oppenheimer was a contradiction himself. He funded largely the Progressive Party, including the career of Helen Suzman. But at the same time, he did not call for reforms in labor practices, especially in the mining sector, where his companies were. And he had very little respect for African society or African culture. Even made statements that were in line with what many whites felt about Africans, that they were inferior, that they were uncivilized. So Oppenheimer, on the one hand, didn't like apartheid. On the other hand, was certainly no friend to the non-white communities and no admirer of them. Okay. So that's, I think, the extent of white criticism and white resistance to apartheid. In the next lecture, we'll talk about some non-white and especially Black African resistance to apartheid.